Is this the end for Microsoft as a hardware manufacturer? Are we about to see previous exclusives like Halo and Gears of War hit the PlayStation and Switch? What will ever happen to the Xbox brand? Unfortunately, the answer to all those questions is, I don't know. I'm filming this before Microsoft uploads their podcast and reveals their future plans. But from what's been reported, it certainly sounds like Microsoft is considering bringing some of their highest profile titles to competing systems, though that may not mean that they're going to fully exit the console market. If you're old enough, then all of this might sound oddly familiar. No matter what Microsoft ends up doing, all of this echoes what Sega announced on January 31st, 2001. When they revealed their plans to cease production of the 2-year-old Dreamcast and transition into a new life as a third-party publisher. While everybody else spends today pontificating over what Microsoft's announcement means for the industry and future console wars, I want to take a moment to look back at what happened 23 years ago. Let's see how magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly and Next Generation reported Sega's sudden news, and more importantly, how their readers reacted. This is what happened when Sega left the console war. Before we dive into the angry letters, let's first see how we got here. After Nintendo thoroughly dominated the 8-bit market, Sega successfully fought back in the 1990s with a 16-bit system that may not have beaten the Super Nintendo in worldwide sales, but stayed competitive and proved that Nintendo had a weakness. Unfortunately, their 32-bit follow-up, the Sega Saturn, under-delivered despite the initial success in Japan, leaving Sega in an incredibly vulnerable position. Their last hope came in the form of the Dreamcast, which may have performed well in the United States, but couldn't gain traction around the world. To make matters worse, Sony, Nintendo, and even Microsoft were all readying a tidal wave of competition against the already money-strapped Sega, which ultimately led the company to make the difficult announcement on January 31st, 2001. Now, there had been rumors and speculation that Sega would leave the hardware market for years, largely started as Saturn units began to disappear off of store shelves. But even if magazines like Next Generation and Edge had openly pondered what a third-party Sega would look like, the announcement still caught a lot of people off guard. Believe it or not, it all started with a rumor that was first published in the New York Times. Is Nintendo going to buy Sega? Nintendo flatly denied it, and the whole thing seemed ridiculous. But it did suggest that Sega was not in a position of strength going into 2001. Only 1 month later, we saw articles reporting the sad news. The world of gaming is changing, so Sega must change too, explained Sega COO Hideki Sato, which was just one of the quotes featured in magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly and Next Generation. For the most part, these articles are exactly what you'd expect. They report on the announcement and then speculate about what games could be coming to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and GameCube. Next Generation did go one step further by chatting with Sega co-founder David Rosen. When asked if going third-party was a good idea, he said, "I've been advocating this for more than 7 years now and always felt like it was a bit of a folly for them to be limiting their potential to Sega hardware." He argued that Sega has the potential to catch Electronic Arts and as short as 2 and certainly within 3 years. Across the pond, UK magazine Edge was really the only publication to highlight Sega's decision on their cover. More importantly, they went out of their way to get quotes from some of Sega's friends and competitors. For example, Sony Europe's Brendan McNamara praised the company. Anyone growing up wasting their pocket money on Space Harrier and Outrun would have nothing but admiration for Sega as a software company. We're glad to have them on board, although a little scared by the quality of the competition they'll provide. It will definitely raise the standard of the PlayStation 2 games even further. Of course, Brendan couldn't waste the opportunity to take a little dig at Microsoft. Unfortunately, any developer wishing to make some money out of the Xbox has to wait for at least another year, which is a long time in this business. Alex Ward over at Criterion was surprised by the speed of the decision, but saw the writing on the wall. They tried valiantly to make it work, but the hardware side of things was obviously holding their business back. Virtua Fighter 4 becomes another killer app for the PlayStation 2 alongside Gran Turismo 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2. Great Sega titles coming to PS2 and Game Boy Advance is just fantastic news all around. And then there's, oh boy, Chris Kingsley over at Rebellion, whose reaction comes across like a fan not ready to accept reality. Sega have done this sort of thing before, so everybody should know what to expect. When the Saturn was fading, they shifted their focus away from it, forming Segasoft to develop for the PC and other platforms. They still came back with a new console a few years later, so I wouldn't write them off completely. Sega have the console bug, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they have some new, cool console waiting in the wings. The deal Sega have signed will probably see the Dreamcast pop up in loads of different places. Perhaps they'll get millions of Dreamcasts out there by stealth. For their part, Nintendo Power chose to pop the bubble and actually acknowledge the larger gaming world outside of their ecosystem. In an article excitedly announcing Sonic the Hedgehog's move to the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo showed off pictures of not just the Dreamcast, but also the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and a clip art of a mobile phone for some reason. They also praised their long-running competitor. From the early 90s to today, Sega's produced numerous hits on their own consoles. Sonic the Hedgehog, Virtua Fighter, and dozens of other titles and licenses have been highly successful over the years. After all these years, Nintendo Power is thrilled to finally have a chance to cover Sega's games. We look forward to working closely with Sega to bring our readers the best coverage possible. Now, when it came to the fan response, you started to see a lot of trends pop up in the mailbag sections. The first trend I'd like to highlight involves a lot of denial and talk about how Sega is a secret genius playing 4D chess. Take this letter from Derek Bamford. Is this the end, or just the beginning? To the untrained gamer, Sega appears to finally lost its grip on the gaming world and will finally bow to the powers of Sony, Nintendo, and the Xbox. But all is not what it seems. There is no use trying to explain this to the legions of Sony and Nintendo fanatics who for years have shunned everything that is Sega. So I hope that all the hardcore gamers out there will understand. When I first heard the news of Dreamcast, and I was, to say the least, disappointed. But upon deeper examination of the situation, I finally realized the genius of Sega's plan. What Sega is doing is probably their smartest move yet. Like a virus, Sega will infect every system until you can't get away from them, focusing on software and increasing their market share, ruling the video game industry. I applaud Sega and will stick by them in their new era of glory. Derek isn't the only one who feels this way. Kurtz83 said that he was disappointed that the Dreamcast was being phased out, but if it will show gamers that Sega is number one, I'm all for it. Hawkins asked, Deadcast? Don't kid yourself, not by a long shot. The Sega Dreamcast is the best system in the history of video games. All Sega has done is relegate it to eternal cult status. And then there's the S-Man27, who explains that the Dreamcast is not dead, just in a coma. Another trend that you saw were the know-it-alls that were able to see the future with crystal clarity. Take Snake Eyes 1 as an example of this. I knew the Dreamcast was dead as soon as it was announced. I'm not the least bit surprised by the way the young Dreamcast has begun its flaming descent into the center of video game hell. What does surprise me is Sega's move on to creating games for other systems. I thought that Sega would keep on trying until the creditors padlocked the doors. There were other letters that hoped that this would become a teachable moment for the games industry. Roel Cole asks, will the industry ever mature to the point of developing a single console standard? With Sega stopping Dreamcast manufacture in March, another platform seems destined to die. Surely, a single standard would strengthen the industry. Sony, Nintendo, Sega, and Microsoft could manufacture their own hardware that could play any game meeting the new standard. Other industries have shifted towards the standardization, lessening the risk of developing for the wrong product and creating a level playing field for all companies, small and large. If my Samsung DVD player could only play Samsung-compatible discs, I wouldn't have bought it. Surely this applies to video games. It does, but don't call me Shirley. Even with all the articles and the speculation, there were a lot of gamers who wrote in with legitimately good questions. For example, Adam Hoffer explains that I have recently heard about Sega's plan to slowly drop Dreamcast and make games for other platforms. What will become of Sega? I'm a SegaNet user, and I think it's the best internet provider I've ever used, and I've tried them all. Are they gonna bill me $150 for the online rebate? Are they gonna keep making great games for Dreamcast? Help! You also ran into a lot of people that were a lot more concerned about Shenmue than Sega. Matt asked, now that Sega has made it official and will begin developing on other systems, how will this affect the ongoing Shenmue saga? Will it stay on the Dreamcast, make a move to the PlayStation 2, or just die off altogether? Jeff had the exact same questions, wondering when and where the Shenmue sequels would come out. Now, believe it or not, there weren't a lot of outwardly angry letters, though I'm sure every one of these magazines was inundated with them. One that slipped through was from Iceman. I've had it. Sega is doing an amazing job and is having the best years in sales of its life. Recent news says that they're pulling the Dreamcast hardware and sticking to software. This has got to be wrong because their sales in America were neck and neck with the PlayStation 2. This has got to make up for the bad Japanese sales. I don't want to have to buy a PS2 eventually to play Sega in 2002 and beyond. Adam, the EVA pilot Damon, echoed a lot of those thoughts when he wrote into Hyper. The recent news regarding the Sega Dreamcast has left me disillusioned with the gaming community. I find it baffling that a console so good with so many original and fun games is unable to be a serious contender in the upcoming system wars. Gamers out there have let one of the best things ever to happen to the gaming industry slip through their fingers. I do find solace in the fact that games will continue to be produced for the next 18 months. And Sega, as a development company, will continue to exist. Yes, the Dreamcast will go down in history as the most underrated console ever. And on one final note, this drawing was featured in Hyper magazine just 1 month before the news broke. Little did David know that a silly cartoon would become a reality just a few weeks later. You know, there's some truth to the people who say that the Dreamcast would go down in history as one of the most underrated consoles ever and be relegated to the eternal cult status. That is certainly how a generation of gamers looks at the final Sega console. And through thick and thin, these fans have continued to support Sega. They may not have been able to recapture the magic of the glory days, but Sega certainly proved that there is life after quitting the hardware market. Hey, thanks for watching me take a look back at the Sega announcement and thumb through these classic magazines. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we actually have a bunch of shows that talk about classic reviews and find trends in all of those old magazines. Now, here's the question I have for you. Should Microsoft go third party? It's simple. I don't care what Microsoft announces. I just want to know what you think. Let me hear your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we're going to wrap up the week with a brand new episode of Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew on Friday, plus a review of the new Pong game on Monday. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.